My name is Derek Brose. For the last 10 years, I've worked as an investigative journalist, hosting a radio show, writing books, and producing numerous documentaries about the realities of child trafficking, the dangers of technology, and indigenous struggles. Now, I aim to uncover whether there exists a network of individuals and institutions which ties these issues together. Many researchers posit the existence of an international cartel which covertly manipulates world events for their own benefit. Are these claims simply fantasy and paranoid delusion, or is there truly an agenda to subvert humanity to the demands of the pyramid of power?
As we continue the journey to understand the true source of humanity's ills, we have started to identify the first pieces of the pyramid of power. My attempts to confirm or deny the existence of a ruling class led me to investigate the state-run education system, the establishment media, the big tech firms, and the Hollywood propaganda machine. What I have uncovered thus far has been absolutely disturbing. Attempts to manipulate the youth through prison-like education centers, the mainstream media being infiltrated by spies since at least the 1940s, big tech firms manipulating your emotions for profit and control, as well as intelligence connections, and finally, a number of influential and popular Hollywood films collaborating with the CIA in the hopes of rewriting or whitewashing history. It's time to see if I can uncover more connections between government agencies and big corporations. What other pieces of the pyramid of power are waiting to be revealed? Chapter 5: Big Wireless. In September 2018, I began investigating the wireless industry after Verizon announced plans to install 5G technology in my hometown of Houston, Texas. My investigation resulted in a documentary called The 5G Trojan Horse. This chapter on Big Wireless is sourced from that documentary. First, let's clarify exactly who or what Big Wireless is. To do that, we need to understand some background information on the wireless industry and wireless technology itself, starting with electromagnetic frequencies, or EMFs. An EMF is a measure of how many times the peak of a wave passes a particular point per second. This range of potential frequencies makes up what we call the electromagnetic spectrum. The electromagnetic spectrum is divided into separate bands, and the electromagnetic waves within each frequency band are called by different names, including radio waves, microwaves, infrared, visible light, ultraviolet, X-rays, and gamma rays at the high-frequency short wavelength end. Devices like cell phones, Wi-Fi, and Bluetooth all operate on the microwaves band of the spectrum. When it comes to cell phones, a new generation of cellular standards has appeared approximately every 10 years since 1G systems were first introduced in 1979 and the early to mid-1980s. Each generation features new frequency bands, higher data rates, and non-backwards compatible transmission technology. The second generation, or 2G, featured cell phones with texting and pictures. The third generation came around 2000 with the introduction of phones with some internet, video, and images. The fourth generation came around 2009 with the introduction of smartphones with instant streaming of video as well as the use of apps. In the late teens, early 20s, we began the shift to the fifth generation, or 5G. In addition to being promoted as the solution to 4K movie downloads, the new technology is expected to herald the beginning of smart cities, where driverless cars, traffic lights, pollution sensors, smartphones, and countless other smart devices interact in what is known as the Internet of Things. We will be covering the concerns around smart cities in a future episode. Health concerns associated with EMFs. As part of my research, I wanted to understand the concerns around EMFs in general. I went through hundreds of studies, including those from official government sources and others funded independently. I found studies like the International and National Expert Group Evaluations, Biological Health Effects of Radio Frequency Fields, which examined 6 decades worth of research into the effects of in vitro and in vivo exposures of animals and humans and their cells to RF fields. The researchers wrote, quote, "Data reported in peer-reviewed scientific publications were contradictory. Some indicated effects while others did not. Still, in the end, the expert group suggested a, quote, reduction in exposure fields, precautionary approach, and further research. So I continued digging. I found a 2004 study which detected an increased risk of acoustic neuroma tumors associated with mobile phone use of at least 10 years duration. I also found studies that were inconclusive, which found, quote, no conclusive evidence of an association between use of mobile and cordless phones and a meningioma brain tumor. The study discovered, quote, an indication of increased risk, but was not, quote, supported by statistically significant increasing risk, ultimately calling for further studies. I came across the name of Dr. Martin Pall, a professor emeritus of biochemistry and basic medical sciences at Washington State University. Pall is a published and widely cited scientist on the biological effects of electromagnetic fields, an expert in how wireless radiation impacts the electrical systems in our bodies. He has published 7 studies showing sensitivity to electromagnetic fields exists in what is known as the voltage sensor in each cell of the body. A study by Pall, published in the Journal of Environmental Health, found this sensitivity in human cells in response to Wi-Fi exposure. He calls this effect an important threat to human health. Despite the breadth of his work, Dr. Pall has largely been pushed to the fringes of society. To be fair, his work has been criticized by other scientists who have accused him of bias and cherry-picking studies to support his claims. In 2018, I asked Dr. Martin Pall why his research has been ignored and pushed out of the mainstream conversation.
We quit funding the studies of this sort back between 1986 and 1999. We've done almost nothing since then. So basically, the U.S. government's been pushing these technologies at the same time doing absolutely nothing, or almost absolutely nothing, to protect us.
The debate around the safety of cell phones and other devices that emit EMFs grew even more heated in early November 2018 when the National Toxicology Program released data concluding there is clear evidence radiofrequency radiation can cause brain and heart tumors in male lab rats. The $30 million study took more than 10 years to complete as researchers examined the effects of prolonged exposure to high levels of radiofrequency radiation, specifically the type of radiation emitted via 2G and 3G cellular networks. The researchers write, quote, there was also some evidence of tumors in the brain and adrenal gland of exposed male rats. For female rats and male and female mice, the evidence was equivocal as to whether cancers observed were associated with exposure to radiofrequency radiation. Most damning of all, Senator Richard Blumenthal of Connecticut exposed that the wireless industry and the FCC have failed to do adequate independent studies into the effects of emerging 5G technology. At a Senate Commerce Committee hearing, Blumenthal questioned industry reps about the absence of this research.
If you go to the FDA website, pretty unsatisfactory. There basically is a cursory and superficial citation to existing scientific data saying, quote, the FDA has urged the cell phone industry to take a number of steps, including support additional research on possible biological effects of radiofrequency fields for the type of signal emitted by cell phones. I believe that Americans deserve to know what the health effects are. My question for you, particularly Mr. Gillen and Mr. Perry, how much money has the industry committed to supporting additional independent research? I stress independent research. Is that independent research ongoing? Has any been completed? Where can consumers look for it? And we're talking about research on the biological effects of this new technology.
Thank you, Senator. I think, thank you for your focus on the issue. Safety is paramount, and as you alluded to, we rely on the expert agencies, we rely on the findings of the FDA and others as to the requirements to keep all of us safe. There are no industry-backed studies, to my knowledge right now. Happy to visit with you as to what opportunities you think there needs to be more studies, and we're always for more science. We also rely on what the scientists tell us.
At the end of the exchange, Blumenthal concluded,
so there really is no research ongoing. We're kind of flying blind here, so far as health and safety is concerned. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
if you would like to know more about the safety concerns, I recommend watching the 5G Trojan Horse. But what became clear to me is that the so-called health authorities, regulators of the wireless industry, and corporate media have been failing at their jobs. Cover-ups and captured agencies. How could this happen? How can the US government allow potentially hazardous products to be sold and used by millions of people? In 1996, the Telecommunications Act was passed as an effort to update the law around communications technology as the internet was beginning to come into mass public use. The act was also seen as a way to limit the growing AT&T monopoly. Unfortunately, it was the beginning of further consolidation of telecommunications companies and a huge step towards eroding local power.
This law is truly revolutionary legislation that will bring the future to our doorstep.
The 1996 Act prohibits local jurisdictions from considering perceived health effects when taking action on a proposed facility, such as a tower or a small cell. Instead, cities and towns could only regulate cell sites based on the aesthetics and the location of the devices. The Telecommunications Act of 1996 states, quote, "No state or local government or instrumentality thereof may regulate the placement, construction, and modification of personal wireless service facilities on the basis of the environmental effects of radio frequency emissions to the extent that such facilities comply with Commission's regulations concerning such emissions." Essentially, as long as the facilities comply with the standards set by the FCC, they cannot be subjected to environmental or health regulations. But what happens if those federal standards set by the FCC in 1996 are not adequate? There are studies which show health effects even at levels allowed by the 1996 Telecommunications Act, not to mention the fact that the standards are over 2 decades old and based on outdated technology. Not only was the Telecom Act designed to protect the profits of the big wireless companies, but somewhere along the way, the FCC and the telecoms developed an incestuous relationship that has overtaken the voices and the concerns of the people. A 2015 expose published by investigative journalist Norm Auster shows the financial ties between the U.S. Federal Communications Commission and the telecoms industry and how, as a result, the wireless industry bought unfettered access to and power over a major U.S. regulatory agency. The report, Captured Agency, How the Federal Communications Commission is Dominated by the Industry It Presumably Regulates, details how the FCC, an independent government agency created in 1934 to regulate interstate communications by radio, TV, wire, satellite, and cable, has become a captured agency with big wireless leaders filling the government seats in a revolving door fashion similar to other federal agencies. Regarding the passing of the 1996 Telecom Act, Norm Auster writes, quote, "Late lobbying won the wireless industry enormous concessions from lawmakers, many of them major recipients of industry hard and soft dollar contributions. Congressional staffers who helped lobbyists write the new law did not go unrewarded. 13 of 15 staffers later became lobbyists themselves." Auster states that the direct lobbying by industry is, quote, "just one of many worms in a rotting apple." The report says the FCC is involved in a network of powerful moneyed interests with limitless access and a variety of ways to shape policy. Auster believes the worst part is that the wireless industry has been allowed to grow unchecked and virtually unregulated, with fundamental questions on public health routinely ignored. Unfortunately, the situation goes beyond corrupted government agencies and into defaming those who speak out against potential harms caused by wireless technology. During the 1990s, biochemist Jerry Phillips was hired by cell phone giant Motorola to study the effects of RF radiation emitted by cell phones. Phillips and his colleagues looked at the effects of different RF signals on rats and on cells in a dish.
The bottom line really is that, yes, RFR exposure is associated with damage to DNA.
Phillips says the relationship between him and his employer was initially cordial, but soured once he submitted research data to Motorola which found harmful effects to the DNA structure as a result of exposure to radio frequency radiation. The negative results were not to Motorola's liking, and they began putting pressure on him. In another example of industry attempting to influence research, we have Dr. Henry Lai of the University of Washington and fellow researcher Narendra Singh. The researchers were looking at the effects of non-ionizing radiation, the same type of radiation emitted by cell phones, on the DNA of rats. They used a level of radiation considered safe by FCC standards and found that the DNA and the brain cells of the rats was damaged or broken by exposure to radiation. After publishing his research in 1995, Dr. Lai would later learn of a full-scale effort to discredit the experiments. Lai and Singh caused controversy when they publicly complained about restrictions placed on their research by their funders, the Wireless Technology Research Program. In response to this public action, the head of the Wireless Technology Research sent a memo asking then University President Richard McCormick to fire Lai and Singh. McCormick refused, but the message was clear. Get rid of anyone who makes our products look bad. In a leaked internal Motorola memo, executives claim to have succeeded in, quote, wargaming the Lie-Sing experiments. This shocked me, the letter trying to discredit me, the War Games memo. As a scientist doing research, I was not expecting to be involved in a political situation. It opened my eyes on how games are played in the world of business. You don't bite the hand that feeds you. The pressure is very impressive. Think about that for a moment. An international corporation trying to exert pressure on scientists who draw conclusions that their product is causing harm to human health. Even further, Dr. Lie's experiments show negative health consequences at levels considered safe by the FCC. The captured agency report makes it clear that this type of corruption takes place because of the, quote, free flow of executive leadership between the FCC and industries it presumably oversees. For example, at the time of the report's release, the chairman of the FCC was Tom Wheeler, a man with deep ties to the big wireless industry. In 2013, Wheeler was nominated as FCC chairman by former President Obama after raising more than $700,000 for his presidential campaigns. Wheeler led the two most powerful industry lobbying groups, the National Cable and Telecommunications Association and the Cellular Telecommunications and Internet Association, or the CTIA. The current chairman of the FCC is also another example of a captured agency in action. Ajit Pai, a lawyer and chairman of the FCC under both Obama and Trump, served as an associate general counsel at Verizon Communications between 2001 and 2003, where he handled competition and regulatory matters. Pai was appointed to the FCC by Barack Obama in 2012 and then made FCC chairman by Donald Trump in January 2017. FCC Commissioner Brendan Carr is another example of a government official working closely with industry and maintaining relationships which clearly present conflicts of interest. Carr is credited with accelerating the 5G build-out. Prior to joining the FCC, Carr worked as an attorney at Wiley Rein, where his clients were Verizon, AT&T, CenturyLink, the CTIA, and the USTA, the telecom lobby. The Wiley Rein law firm is a hotbed of activity for former government officials and industry regulars. One of the founders of the law firm is Richard Wiley, himself a former FCC chairman. On September 30th, 2019, Commissioner Carr and other officials were in Houston to discuss the future of 5G. I asked Commissioner Carr about the concerns regarding his connections with the wireless industry. I also asked him about the captured agency report released by Harvard School of Ethics. Unfortunately, Mr. Carr had no interest in addressing these questions.
We're very excited about the build-out of 5G and next-gen internet infrastructure. And at the FCC, we've been really building on a lot of the policies that state and local leaders have been putting in place to make sure that every single community can benefit. It's really a great job story. It's a great story for economic growth. So we're really happy with the progress that we're seeing in building out 5G, both here in Houston and in a lot of other communities around the country.
What about those who have concerns, say for example, Harvard that put out the study about captured agency, that folks like yourself who've been lawyers and worked in the industry are essentially captured the regulators, you know, this idea that the FCC can't be trusted to regulate 5G and cell phones and things of that sort because of not only yours but Ajit Pai and others' industry connections.
Yeah, we're really glad to see the growth in 5G. And one of the things that we've done at the FCC is build on the policies put in place by local elected leaders here in Houston. Texas, the state legislature put policies in place that help guide the way for 5G builds. So we're really excited with the progress that we're seeing by really taking the lead of so many of these local elected officials.
No comment on the conflict of interest concerns?
Thanks, man. Appreciate it. Good to talk to you.
The following day, I was able to question Commissioner Carr for a second time, and once again, he avoided my questions.
Mr. Carr, can I follow up with you on yesterday?
I'm good, man. Thank you.
All right, well, then we'll just do it this way. All right, so look, you have ties to the industry. We'll just be more blunt this time since trying nice doesn't seem to work with you guys. So you have ties to the industry.
Thanks, man. We're not
you omitted those facts. It's not press. You're a public servant. You're walking the streets. So you've been with the FCC. You've worked with a law firm that defended the CTI, the people who organized this whole thing. The CTI gave the mayor the 5G Wireless Champion Award. I mean, essentially this whole thing was just a big industry. There's not a single mention of lawsuits on the state level, on the federal level. I'm sure you're aware that there are cities in Texas that are suing right now because those are the stakeholders that are being ignored. They're not, the surveillance concerns are being ignored. You guys talked about all these sensors, all these great things, but not a single person mentioned that there are privacy concerns, there are health concerns that I know you're aware. The FCC recently announced that they're even going to reevaluate cell phones, because the Chicago Tribune study showed that iPhones are putting off 200 times the radiation that you guys allow and say is safe. I mean, realistically, you can't even comment on that.
Thanks, man. It's really good to see you again. Thanks for showing up at the event. Appreciate it.
Of course I'm here, but I mean, I'm just saying, people see you respond like this, and it doesn't even seem like human. You can't even like acknowledge or say a simple statement. But I guess that's what we should expect from the federal government.
Much of this revolving door relationship between industry and government can be traced to the CTIA, the Cellular, Telecommunications, and Internet Association. Established in 1984, the CTIA claims to represent the U.S. wireless communications industry from carriers and equipment manufacturers. The CTIA is active on a wide range of issues, including spectrum policy, wireless infrastructure, and the Internet of Things. They also host events on topics ranging from cybersecurity to 5G. The CTIA's board of directors includes the presidents, CEOs, and other senior officials of Verizon, T-Mobile, Nokia, Ericsson, Intel, General Motors, TracFone, and Easy Texting. Brad Gillen, the current executive vice president of the CTIA, was formerly a legal advisor to a former FCC commissioner and served in other senior policy roles at the FCC and Dish Network. Mr. Gillen was also a partner at Wilkinson, Barker & Nauer, a law firm stacked with former employees of the FCC, the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, the FTC, and other state government positions. The CTIA's current president and CEO is Meredith Atwell Baker. Baker has spent the last 2 decades bouncing between lobbying for big wireless and working for the government. From 1998 to 2000, Baker worked as director of the congressional affairs at the CTIA. Afterwards, she worked for the U.S. government as an FCC commissioner between July 2009 to June 2011. She then went back to the CTIA, where she is now president and CEO in charge of promoting the so-called race to 5G. The race to 5G could be described as a clever marketing campaign designed to sell consumers an upgrade they did not know they wanted or needed. Not to mention, an upgrade that has sparked lawsuits and has many health and privacy concerns. As part of the ongoing race to 5G, telecom companies are promoting 5G as a solution for faster downloads and high-definition movie streaming. Although it's not clear if the public is demanding faster downloads, the telecoms, global governments, and the tech industry are pushing the shift towards 5G. While it is true that 5G has the potential to spur on innovation in the fields of medicine, manufacturing, entertainment, and other industries, there has not been a truly organic call for this emerging technology. Much of the hype around 5G is coming from the CTIA itself. It appears that the CTIA, the organization created to lobby explicitly for the wireless industry, along with their partners in government agencies, law firms, and international health authorities, are, in fact, big wireless.
5G is a race, and we must win.
These institutions work together to stifle research which shows the harmful effects of their products while placing loyal agents in government and regulatory fields. But what about the media? Why has the mainstream media failed to report on these concerns? As more health professionals, politicians, and scientists speak out against the dangers of EMFs, the cellular industry and some in the mainstream media have begun pushing back. In March 2019, William Broad of the New York Times wrote a piece promoting the idea that those who are concerned about the health effects of 5G are simply falling prey to Russian propaganda designed to make America lose the race to 5G. His article, "Your 5G phone won't hurt you, but Russia wants you to think otherwise," sought to place the blame for concern around 5G on the shoulders of America's favorite boogeyman, the Russians. Interestingly, he failed to mention that in April 2019, the Times announced a partnership with Verizon to showcase a 5G journalism lab. This seems to be a new trend for corporate media, as the Washington Post also announced a similar deal with AT&T in November 2019. Questions regarding potential conflicts of interest have not been answered. Dr. Deborah Davis, PhD, president of the Environmental Health Trust, responded to the New York Times claims by noting that, quote, "By relegating concerns about 5G to a Russian ploy, he misses altogether the fact that the purportedly independent international authorities on which he relies that declare 5G to be safe are an exclusive club of industry-loyal scientists. China, Russia, Poland, Italy, and several other European countries allow up to hundreds of times less wireless radiation into the environment from microwave antennas than does the US. Davis went even further, comparing the treatment of those who raise awareness about the public impact of radio frequency radiation to that of the scientists in the 1950s and 60s who attempted to ring alarm bells about the dangers of tobacco. Quote, scientists who showed the harmful impacts of tobacco find themselves struggling for serious attention and financial support. For health impacts from wireless radiation, a similar pattern is emerging. Each time a U.S. government agency produced positive findings, research on health impacts was defunded. The Office of Naval Research, the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health, the Department of Health, Education and Welfare, and the Environmental Protection Agency all once had vibrant research programs documenting dangers of wireless radiation. All found their programs scrapped, reflecting pressure from those who sought to suppress this work. So this brings us to a new understanding. The wireless industry, the media, and government agencies created to regulate the wireless industry have been conspiring for more than 2 decades to cover up their corruption and endanger public health. We should also remember that this is not only a problem in the United States. There are agencies and institutions acting in the same manner all around the world. So what can we do about it? Solutions. When it comes to fighting against the corruption within government agencies, step 1 is to expose it. We need mass movements aimed at exposing all of the elements of the pyramid, including big wireless. For those who believe in voting and fighting in the political arena, make efforts to get rid of these corrupt politicians in the captured agencies. And while it is true that the corporate media has attempted to paint anyone who has concerns around wireless technology as conspiracy theorists, the numbers are growing. If we continue to expose this information, we can build a movement that will support bringing the truth to light. At the same time, we can also try to limit our exposure and use of wireless devices. And this might sound crazy in a world as interconnected as ours, but if we do take some individual responsibility, then ultimately, we are to blame for invasions of our privacy, potentially harmful effects, and for supporting a corrupt industry. It's up to you to decide what this looks like. Additionally, there are companies which sell protective gear, clothing, and devices to protect you from EMF exposure. There is also the possibility of rewiring your house by choosing to plug into your modem rather than use Bluetooth or Wi-Fi. You can buy wired keyboards and mice as well. This will require lifestyle changes, but it can be done. As with all of the solutions presented within this series, creating change for the better will require individual responsibility and action, while also building movements for collective liberation. Together, we can finally break free from the grip of big wireless. For more information on this topic, we recommend watching the 5G Trojan Horse documentary and reading the Captured Agency report by the Harvard School of Ethics.
Chapter 6: The Oligarchy. Petroleum, or oil, is one of the most widely used substances in the world. Oil and its byproducts, petrochemicals, are used in a number of ways in our daily lives. For fuel and lubricants in our vehicles, and for plastics used in our homes, shops, and restaurants. Wars have been fought over oil, and fortunes have been made extracting it from the earth. Clearly, the substance plays a vital role in the history of humanity. Those who created the massive oil industry we know today, sometimes known as Big Oil or the oligarchy, reaped massive benefits for their efforts. But were the intentions of these tycoons purely based on profit and propelling humanity forward towards innovation? Or, as many researchers have proposed, is there a more nefarious agenda behind the history and the future of the oligarchy? The Standard Oil Monopoly. The roots of today's major oil companies go back to the founding of the oil industry by John D. Rockefeller and his company Standard Oil. Shortly before the U.S. Civil War in 1861, Rockefeller helped establish a shipping company in Cleveland, Ohio. This company would evolve as Rockefeller and partners began investing in crude oil businesses. By 1870, Rockefeller and partners operated 2 oil refineries in Cleveland. They incorporated their business in Ohio under the name Standard Oil Company. Rockefeller's company grew to become a monopoly over the burgeoning oil industry. In March 1872, during what became known as the Cleveland Massacre, Rockefeller's Standard Oil purchased 22 of its 26 competitors. Rockefeller now controlled 25% of the U.S. oil industry at the time.
Rockefeller is widely heralded for his work ethic, which may have lacked in ethics while it thrived in squashing competition. He believed that large industrial corporate conglomerates were destined to replace competition in business. By 1880, Standard Oil now owned or controlled 90% of the U.S. oil refinery industry. Eventually, Rockefeller and his cronies moved Standard Oil from Cleveland to New York City to form a trust where they would be in control of the vast number of companies now wholly or partly owned by Standard Oil. Standard Oil made its wealth by producing kerosene for lamps and controlling thousands of pipelines delivering oil products around the country. The kerosene lamps being lit by millions of Americans helped Rockefeller become America's first billionaire as a result of the massive profits reaped by the companies which he held a majority stock in. However, Rockefeller was not universally revered. Many began to push back against his business practices and question the legitimacy of his oil empire. Beginning in 1887, 10 states and the Oklahoma Territory filed lawsuits against companies owned by the Standard Oil Trust. Standard lost many cases, but found that by shifting their operations from one state to the next, they could evade court rulings. Rockefeller's luck would run out as the public grew weary of monopolies thanks to the work of investigative journalists known as muckrakers. Starting in November 1902, trailblazing journalist Ida Tarbell wrote a 19-part investigation into the practices of Standard Oil. She detailed how John D. Rockefeller ruthlessly forced his competition to sell or perish. Tarbell also reported that Rockefeller had secretly arranged for discounted shipping rates from railroads. While small businesses and farmers were forced to pay higher rates, Standard Oil received preferential treatment. This type of arrangement was outlawed by the Interstate Commerce Act of 1887. Ida Tarbell's reporting showed that these arrangements and others made by Rockefeller were essential in maintaining the Standard Oil monopoly. Rockefeller and his associates did not build the Standard Oil Company and the boardrooms of Wall Street banks, Tarbell wrote. They fought their way to control by rebate and drawback, bribe and blackmail, espionage and price cutting, by ruthless efficiency of organization. Americans had grown to distrust the so-called robber barons of the day, and support for antitrust legislation reached a peak with nearly 30 states passing antitrust laws to stop monopoly abuses. The reporting of Ida Tarbell and the muckrakers created the climate which led the U.S. government to sue Standard Oil of New Jersey on November 18, 1906. The suit claimed that the Standard Oil Trust had violated the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. The trial against Standard Oil began in 1908 in a Missouri federal court. Evidence was presented showing that Standard Oil had indeed secured illegal railroad discounts, as well as blocking competitors from using oil pipelines, spying on other companies, and bribing politicians. While Standard Oil grew their monopolistic domination, they also rose prices by 46% between 1895 and 1906. The judge and a subsequent federal appeals court found that Standard Oil was a monopoly in violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act. The judge recommended that Standard Oil be broken up into independent companies. Rockefeller and his Standard Oil Trust appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, and on May 15, 1911, the Supreme Court unanimously upheld the ruling that Standard was a monopoly guilty of illegally restraining trade. The court agreed that the best way to restore competition in the industry was to break the company into individual companies. In reality, the government allowed Standard Oil stockholders to receive fractional shares in all 34 companies that were formed from the trust. This essentially meant that the companies had the same stockholder owners as before. The major Standard Oil companies that were broken up include Standard Oil of New Jersey, which became Esso before eventually merging with another company to form Exxon. Standard Oil of New York eventually became Mobil. Exxon and Mobil would eventually merge, forming the Exxon Mobil Company. Standard Oil of California eventually became Chevron. Standard Oil of Indiana became the American Oil Company, which is now part of BP, British Petroleum. The Continental Oil Company would merge and evolve to become Phillips 66. Although the Supreme Court decision is often touted as the breaking up of Standard Oil, it appears the trust had a temporary breakup before reorganizing, swallowing up competition, and merging under new names. ExxonMobil, Chevron, Phillips 66, these are common names the average driver knows even if they have no understanding of the Rockefeller connection. But the Rockefellers were not alone in their pursuit of wealth, power, and dominance in the oil game. The infamous Rothschild dynasty was also interested in taking advantage of the wealth and power created by the oligarchy.
One such competitor emerged from the Caucasus in the 1870s, where Imperial Russia had opened up the vast Caspian Sea oil deposits to private development. Two families quickly combined forces to take advantage of the opportunity. The Nobels, led by Ludwig Nobel and including his dynamite-inventing, prize-creating brother Alfred, and the French branch of the infamous Rothschild banking dynasty, led by Alphonse Rothschild. In 1891, the Rothschilds contracted with M. Samuel & Co., a Far East shipping company headquartered in London and run by Marcus Samuel, to do what had never been done before: ship their Nobel-supplied Caspian oil through the Suez Canal to East Asian markets. The project was immense. It involved not only sophisticated engineering to construct the first oil tankers to be approved by the Suez Canal Company, but the strictest secrecy. If word of the endeavor was to get back to Rockefeller through his international intelligence network, it would risk bringing the wrath of Standard Oil, which could afford to cut rates and squeeze them out of the market. In the end, they succeeded, and the first bulk tanker, the Murex, sailed through the Suez Canal in 1892 en route to Thailand. In 1897, M. Samuel & Co. became the Shell Transport and Trading Company. Realizing that reliance on the Rothschild Nobel Caspian oil left the company vulnerable to supply shocks, Shell began to look to the Far East for other sources of oil. In Borneo, they ran up against Royal Dutch Petroleum, established in The Hague in 1890 with the support of King William III of the Netherlands, to develop oil deposits in the Dutch East Indies. The two companies, fearing competition from Standard Oil, merged in 1903 into the Asiatic Petroleum Company, jointly owned with the French Rothschilds, and in 1907 became Royal Dutch Shell.
To reiterate, the majority of the major oil companies in the U.S. are owned in part by the Rockefeller family, while Royal Dutch Shell, the owner of the Shell Oil Company, is a product of scheming by the French Rothschilds and Dutch royalty. And while there are no exact numbers on how much the Dutch royal family of today still owns in Royal Dutch Shell, it is believed that the family has profited billions of dollars from the company. The Dutch were not the only royalty to get involved in the oil industry. The British Crown controlled the majority share of BP, or British Petroleum. As with the Rockefellers, the Rothschilds and royalty from Denmark and Britain will appear throughout this series as we explore the many roles they play in the pyramid of power. The families of the oligarchy were not satisfied with dominating the rapidly expanding oil industry. They recognized that their financial aspirations, now intertwined with the fate of oil, were better served by engineering crises and even supporting wars if it meant a better bottom line and furthering their geopolitical interests.
In the second move of the operation, Kissinger helped negotiate a deal with Saudi Arabia. In exchange for U.S. arms and military protection, the Saudis would price all their future oil sales in dollars and recycle those dollars through treasury purchases via Wall Street banks. The deal was a bonanza for the oligarchs. Not only did they get to pass the price increases on to the consumers, but they benefited from the huge flows of money into their own banks. The Shah of Iran parked the National Iranian Oil Company's revenues in Rockefeller's own Chase Bank, revenues that reached $14 billion per year in the wake of the oil crisis. With the creation of this new system, the petrodollar, the oligarchs had reached unprecedented levels of control over the economy. Not only that, they had backed the world monetary system with their commodity, oil, and brought potential competition from upstart producer nations under their control, all in one step.
With the United States dollar now established as the official currency for buying and selling oil, the big oil magnates were in a position to entrench themselves within the Western political establishment so they might continue to manipulate world events. Peter Dale Scott, author of Drugs, Oil, and War, has written extensively on the role oil, along with drugs, have played in numerous wars and geopolitical disputes.
America's economy has depended since World War II on its manipulation, its use of manipulation, not so much of the oil itself, but the ability to dominate the oil market, and the CIA has been a key role in that. And since when Reagan came to power, and against the Jewish interests in Congress, authorized the sale of a number of advanced armaments, mostly planes, to Saudi Arabia. It was a huge, huge sale, and something like 10% of it was devoted to, promised by the Saudis in exchange to support operations that the CIA wanted to conduct that were too big for the CIA's authorized budget it got from Congress. So this really meant, in the sense, that the CIA was working for this international oil conglomeration, and that was very key in ending the Soviet Union, by the way.
Big Oil conquers the auto industry. The Supreme Court's decision to break up the Standard Oil Trust in 1911 was hardly a setback for the Rockefeller dynasty. Because of the decision, John D. Rockefeller owned 25% in all of the splinter companies, making him the richest man in America and the first billionaire. This wealth, power, and prestige was not something Rockefeller was willing to give up. Rockefeller and the oligarchs recognized that there were many threats to their power. Throughout the early 20th century, Big Oil pushed back against the use of electricity, which was replacing their kerosene lamps. These businesses and wealthy CEOs worried that their oil products might outlive their usefulness and dominance. However, it was also at this time that the first gas-powered vehicles began to appear. Gasoline had previously been seen as a byproduct of oil refining that had limited use. With some lobbying and promotion from Big Oil, America and the world were soon driving loud gasoline cars, while the oil industry once again celebrated monumental profits. Big Oil's domination also faced a threat from alcohol, which was widely known as a cheap, readily available source of fuel. In 1906, the alcohol tax was repealed, and corn ethanol became available at a lower price per gallon than gasoline. If this craze were to take off, anyone with raw vegetable matter could produce their own fuel. As James Corbett has reported, a 1909 USGS report comparing gas and alcohol engines noted that there were fewer restrictions on alcohol engines. This gave alcohol-based fuels a leg up against gasoline. John D. Rockefeller sprung into action by supporting his longtime personal friend, Howard Hyde Russell, to fund the Anti-Saloon League in 1893. The league was funded by yearly donations from John D. Rockefeller. This funding allowed Russell to use the league as a mouthpiece for anti-alcohol propaganda. Once prohibition became law in 1920, increasingly burdensome restrictions were placed on ethanol producers. The government required producers to add deadly petroleum products to their ethanol before being sold. The alcohol-based fuel industry could not stand up to the Rockefellers' latest effort to smother competition. Alcohol was not the only alternative to oil-powered vehicles, which appears to have been crushed by the weight of Big Oil. In the documentary Who Killed the Electric Car, we hear more testimony about the role Big Oil played in suppressing the electric car. In addition to the electric car, there are also reports of inventors creating various forms of alternative energy or cleaner fuel. Some of these inventors claim to have their creations destroyed, their lives threatened, and inventions purchased only to be shelved and kept from the public. Big Oil in the 21st century. On first glance, it would appear that many people have woken up to the agenda of Big Oil. Young people all over the world have come to see climate change as the greatest existential threat to their generation. They protest and strike and demand the world's major corporations pay higher taxes and offset their pollution via carbon schemes. By all appearances, Big Oil has been exposed. Unfortunately, the truth is less optimistic. The reality is that many of the major corporations supporting the fight against climate change and supporting United Nations mandates, such as the 1992 UN Convention on Biological Diversity, the Sustainable Development Goals, and Agenda 2030, are the same big oil companies who would likely suffer the most under the proposed changes to business as usual. Could it be that these corporations are simply seeing the writing on the wall and making moves that will ensure they maintain their wealth? Or, perhaps, the big oil titans refuse to be dethroned and will do whatever is necessary to maintain the status quo? Research from InfluenceMap shows that the 5 largest publicly traded oil and gas majors, ExxonMobil, Royal Dutch Shell, Chevron, BP, and Total, have invested over $1 billion of shareholder funds on misleading climate-related branding and lobbying. InfluenceMap reports that, quote, these efforts are overwhelmingly in conflict with the goals of this landmark global climate accord and designed to maintain the social and legal license to operate and expand fossil fuel operations. Continuing to use fossil fuels is only one aspect of the oligarchs' faux environmental movement. They are also actively promoting dangerous solutions to ecological issues. In a report from Navdanya International titled Global Citizens Report: Gates to a Global Empire, the ETC group exposes how modern robber baron Bill Gates
is invested in a technology that is ostensibly aimed at fighting climate change, while he also continues to fund destructive industries. The technology is known as geoengineering, a term which describes an array of technologies that aim, through large-scale and deliberate modifications of the Earth's energy balance, to reduce temperatures and counteract anthropogenic climate change. There are a number of geoengineering proposals, but the one that is most popular and being funded by Bill Gates is known as solar radiation management. SRM involves spraying aerosols and other chemicals from the exhaust of planes with the hope of reflecting sunlight. Numerous studies have warned about the unknown consequences of geoengineering, including the potential for loss of blue skies, droughts, and even more extreme weather. While most reports claim that geoengineering and other forms of weather modification are only in the research phase, a growing number of citizens and researchers are documenting clear evidence of weather modification. We will expand upon this topic in an upcoming chapter. The ETC Group report, dubbed the Sugar Daddy of Geoengineering, looks at the ways in which the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation wield immense influence across the world. The report states, quote, "In fact, Gates has, through personal funding and investments, been one of the major backers of the most extreme forms of geoengineering research for more than a decade. Prominent geoengineers like Ken Caldeira and David Keith are among his close advisors, and his donations are supporting some of the most controversial proposed experiments." Hidden behind Gates's carefully cultivated persona of detached curiosity on climate solutions are significant financial interests in fossil fuel extraction. The report goes on to describe how Gates has been a major shareholder in Canadian national railroads and is making big profits by shipping crude oil from Canada's tar sands to market. Tar sands extraction has been opposed and challenged by Indigenous communities and environmental activists who say the operations are the dirtiest and most destructive form of fossil fuel extraction. While Gates claims to be fighting for the environment, including in a book released in 2021, he continues to hold shares in Canadian national roads and promotes geoengineering projects. Gates is also profiting off big oil money via his estimated $70 billion stock in Microsoft. Microsoft has invested heavily in pursuing big oil giants, signing deals with Exxon, Mobil, Chevron, Shell, and BP. This is but just one example of how the current corporate titans continue to profit off oil while promoting a fight against climate change and United Nations policies that will strip away local political power and place power in the hands of international, centralized institutions. They do not care about the causes they promote so long as they can remain powerful and influential. While the history of these organizations and family may not be widely known, they are still impacting our world in major ways. For example, in the first week of the Trump administration, Donald Trump issued an executive order to fast-track the controversial Dakota Access Pipeline, a project that has a legacy of oil leaks and militarized police. Additionally, Trump passed executive orders which said that pipelines, roads, and railways along the border will take no more than 60 days to be approved or denied, and that the decision will now come directly from the president himself, effectively giving any future president unilateral powers for approving oil projects. In March 2019, further evidence of the relationship between big oil and the U.S. government was revealed after conversations between Interior Secretary David Bernhardt and oil executives were leaked. In a secret recording, oil executives can be heard discussing David Bernhardt and celebrating the access they had during the Trump administration. The recording took place during a 2017 meeting of the Independent Petroleum Association of America in Southern California. The legacy of big oil was established by John D. Rockefeller 150 years ago, and while it may appear that the mood has shifted, that the public is ready to overcome the influence of the oligarchy, there is still more to the story.
The oligarchy, as it existed in the 19th century, is not what it is in the 21st century. I think people will have seen that the stranglehold that the big oil companies held over the economy of the 20th century is not the same in the 21st century. Although obviously big oil companies still are an important part of the economy, there is the very obvious shift that is happening right now as even oil companies themselves try to diversify away from petrochemicals and start to promote the so-called green economy. So there is clearly a shift that's taking place, and the temptation would be for people who were opposed to big oil and what it represented to celebrate, as in the victory has been achieved, big oil is going down. It might take a decade or two or three, but eventually these big oil companies will not have the same stranglehold over the economy as they did before. But I think that completely misses the point, that ultimately the oligarchy was not about oil. It was about money, power, and control. And that money, power, and control has simply shifted into other areas of the economy and other endeavors, which is why we have the seeming paradox of, say, the Rockefeller family itself divesting all of its oil and gas holdings, when that, of course, was what made the Rockefellers into the Rockefellers. Why would they do that if they were simply giving up their power and control? Well, of course, they are not giving up their power and control. They're only giving up their investment in oil and gas. And they themselves are spearheading the drive toward the technocratic ideas that will ultimately eclipse the petrochemical-based economy that we have had over the course of the past 150 years. And those ideas rely on alternative methods of electrical generation, but ultimately it will be things like the smart grid, which will distribute that energy more effectively and also, of course, monitor and control everything that is happening in your house at all times, which will be communicating with everything else through a 5G grid and the Internet of Things. All of these concepts are related, and you find that the same people and families that were behind the oligarchy are heavily invested in these new technologies that will provide them even greater control over the population than the oil manufacturing and production business did back 100 years ago. So actually this in some ways is the culmination of what the oligarchs wanted, which is, again, not to do with oil specifically. If they can control the world by means other than oil, then they'll do it by means other than oil. And I think that is the way that we see things trending right now. And that's why we should not be too quick to celebrate the victory over the oligarchs and the transition into the green economy. The question is, what green economy? Controlled by whom? By what corporations? Funded into existence by whom? And what does that mean in terms of the control that will happen over our lives as we start getting sequestered in our carbon budgets, and every action and interaction that we do becomes monitored in real time to protect the environment, or whatever guise that is put under? Who is driving the sustainable development movement, and what does that mean as sections of the world are cordoned off for the sole and exclusive use of certain connected interests? And do we see names like the Rockefellers and the Rothschilds and the various royal families that have been behind the oil industry? Do we see those names popping up in this new field? Spoiler alert, yes we do.
Solutions. Understanding the full history of the big oil titans and the oligarchy they have created can be overwhelming. As we have been learning with the pyramid, there are many powerful and ruthless powers that treat the world as their chessboard. These powers include families and organizations which appear to have a history of business partnerships and relationships. These titans want to create a world where they profit off every action we take. Whether it's from the fuel in our cars, the plastic bottles, the rubber on your bike tires, and on, big oil is big business. They are prepared to stay in power even as the narrative shifts to condemn the products which have made them rich beyond imagination. Despite these seemingly insurmountable circumstances, there are solutions we can implement in our lives as we work to become free of the stranglehold of the big oil octopus. First off, if you are determined not to enrich the oil companies, find ways to avoid using their products. This would involve not driving, maybe not even riding a bike, foregoing plastic dishes for carryout, no more plastic water bottles, and no more petroleum-based products. This might sound extreme to some, while others may already be practicing these strategies. Boycotting the industry, to whatever degree is possible, is at least one way to stop supplying the industry responsible for so much turmoil with our hard-earned dollars. However, some critics say this attempt at lifestyle activism is insufficient to actually stop the practices of big oil. Some activists will seek political solutions, supporting candidates who promise to remove the influence of big oil, and supporting efforts to pass laws designed to restrict big oil. If these solutions appeal to you, pursue them vigilantly. At the same time, we need to acknowledge that it is the governments which have partnered with the oil titans time and time again. It might not be an effective strategy to expect the captured government regulators to be the savior of the environment and the protectors of the people. If you believe you can raise awareness or achieve lasting change, take action. Whether it's by politics, activism, or civil disobedience, take steps which will enlighten and empower your friends and family about the realities of the big oil complex. To further understand this vast and complex topic, we recommend the following books: The History of the Standard Oil Company by Ida Tarbell, Drugs, Oil, and War by Peter Dale Scott. We also recommend the documentaries How and Why Big Oil Conquered the World from James Corbett and Who Killed the Electric Car. Chapter 7: Big Pharma and the Medical Cartel. One of the most vital components of this pyramid deals with our health and the institutions who decide what constitutes healthy and what constitutes safe. As with the other pieces of the pyramid, many people around the world believe the modern medical and health organizations are largely corrupted and under the spell of what is commonly known as Big Pharma. So what exactly is Big Pharma? Generally speaking, Big Pharma is shorthand for describing the network of major multinational pharmaceutical corporations. There are a wide range of beliefs about Big Pharma, but most of them center around the idea that the pharmaceutical companies and some doctors and scientists in the medical field cooperate in ways that benefit their bank account rather than the health of their patients. This so-called Big Pharma conspiracy theory has been described as a group of conspiracy theories claiming the medical community and pharmaceutical companies in particular, especially large corporations, operate for sinister purposes and against the public good. This includes potentially concealing effective alternative treatments and lying about the harm of certain chemicals. Some people also believe Big Pharma may cause and worsen some diseases. In a 2013 paper, Robert Blaskowitz, assistant professor at the University of Wisconsin, wrote that the Big Pharma conspiracy theory has 4 classic traits. 1. He says believers of this theory assume there is a small malevolent cabal behind it all. 2. They believe the public at large is ignorant of the truth. 3. Believers treat lack of evidence as evidence. 4. He says the arguments deployed in support of the theory are irrational, misconceived, or mistaken. So what's the truth? Is Professor Blaskowitz correct when he says there is no evidence to support this baseless conspiracy? Or are there facts to back up these claims? The transformation of modern medicine. The modern medical industry is characterized by what is sometimes known as allopathic medicine, Western medicine, or evidence-based medicine. This type of treatment tends to focus on treating symptoms and reducing pain. The beginning of this modern era of medicine can be traced back to the founding of the American Medical Association in 1847 and universities like Johns Hopkins University in 1876. With the birth of these organizations, we start to see an increasingly centralized medical care system across the United States and Europe. Opponents of Big Pharma tend to point to this centralization and the creation of new organizations like the AMA as the point where medicine shifted from traditional medicines such as herbal medicine, homeopathy, Ayurveda, and other indigenous medicines towards a system focused on pharmaceuticals and vaccines. The critics of Big Pharma point to the involvement of the Rockefeller family as evidence of a concerted effort to monopolize the medical industry and regulation of what medicines are accepted as safe and effective. In the early 1900s, there were hundreds of doctors operating independently across America. These doctors often offered a variety of healing modalities, including chiropractic, naturopathy, homeopathy, holistic medicine, and herbal medicine. It is around this time that the Rockefeller family began influencing the medical industry. As noted in Chapter 1 of this series, in 1902, Rockefeller Sr. founded the General Education Board with the stated objective to support higher education and medical schools in the United States. Just as Rockefeller and his network of philanthropic organizations sought to influence and shape the direction of public education, so too did he seek to influence the medical schools across the country. While the Rockefeller family used the General Education Board to manipulate America's education system, they also created the International Education Board to invest their money into national and international universities and medical schools which focused on drug-based research. While the Rockefellers played a large role influencing the medical schools and universities, it was the assistance of the Carnegie family that helped transform the industry via their funding, the infamous Flexner Report. In 1905, steel billionaire Andrew Carnegie founded the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching, or simply the Carnegie Foundation. The foundation was granted an official charter by the U.S. Congress in 1906, just as was done with Rockefeller's General Education Board. By 1910, the Carnegie Foundation provided funding for Abraham Flexner to conduct an investigation into the medical doctors and practitioners around the United States. This report is typically seen as a landmark in modern medicine. much of the mainstream medical world regards it as the point when medicine shifted from an industry based on superstition and quackery to a purely scientific, evidence-based tradition. Abraham Flexner was given the resources to investigate the quality of medical education in all 161 medical schools that existed in 1910. Flexner concluded that there were too many medical schools operating at the time and that efforts should be made to shut down schools and doctors who did not practice what the Carnegie-funded and Rockefeller-supported report deemed as evidence-based medicine. Flexner believed that the majority of those practicing medicine in the United States were what is commonly referred to as snake oil salesmen. Flexner's report called on American medical schools to have higher admission and graduation standards as well. The report also called for the standardization of medical education, with only the AMA allowed to grant medical school licensure in the United States. Flexner's recommendations ensured that by 1919, the amount of medical schools went from 161 to 81. Flexner's report also set the stage for the demonization of vitamins for treating various health issues. Although the first vitamins had only recently been discovered at the time of Flexner's study, his attacks on what he deemed quackery also set the stage for downplaying the benefits of vitamins. Despite the widely known benefits of vitamins and essential nutrients, Flexner's report was the beginning of the attempted discrediting of these remedies that continues today. After Flexner finished his report in the United States, he went to Europe to conduct a similar study, which reportedly became nearly as well known as his report in the United States. Flexner would develop a close relationship with the Rockefellers as well. In 1912, after his successful report for the Carnegie Foundation, Flexner joined the Rockefellers' General Education Board, where he was quickly promoted to secretary of the board. In 1913, when John D. Rockefeller Sr. established the Rockefeller Foundation in New York City, Flexner helped merge the General Education Board with the new organization. The General Education Board program of medical education existed from 1913 to 1929 and distributed $94 million to 25 medical schools. The Rockefellers were not content to influence the medical industry in the United States and Europe. They also took their philosophies and dollars to China. In 1914, Rockefeller put up money to establish the China Medical Board, an American organization whose mission statement was to advance health in China and neighboring Asian countries by funding medical, nursing, and public health research and education. The Rockefellers incorporated the China Medical Board in New York and launched the Peking Union Medical College in Beijing from 1914 through 1950. The CMB also worked in Japan, Korea, Hong Kong, Philippines, Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, and Taiwan. Altogether, the Rockefeller-funded China Medical Board invested hundreds of millions of dollars in grants and technical support to medical universities across Far East and Southeast Asia with the goal of bringing the Rockefeller-Carnegie-funded Western allopathic medicine to the world. One of the men who was also funded by Rockefeller was Dr. William Henry Welch, one of the founding professors of Johns Hopkins University. From 1901 to 1933, he worked closely with the Rockefellers as the founding president of the Board of Scientific Directors at the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research. During this time, he was an advisor to John D. Rockefeller and a chief advisor to the U.S. Army's medical department. With the backing of the Rockefellers, he was able to rise to the top of a number of influential organizations and direct the transformation of medical education in the United States. Welch was president of the National Academy of Sciences, the American Medical Association, the Association of American Physicians, the History of Science Society, the Congress of American Physicians and Surgeons, the Society of American Bacteriologists, and the Maryland State Board of Health. It was with Welch's help that Rockefeller was able to bring to life Peking Union Medical College in Beijing. Welch hoped the college would become the, quote, Johns Hopkins in China. It's important to acknowledge that the Rockefeller-guided transformation of the medical and health industry was also an act of displacement and colonization. From the outset, their goal was to replace traditional indigenous medicine and traditions. Prior to the Flexner Report and the Rockefeller investments, individuals were free to decide how they want to medicate themselves and their families. This included a wide variety of medicines and rituals practiced by indigenous cultures around the world. Obviously, not every traditional or natural medicine will deliver the promised results, and there are lying, greedy characters peddling snake oil. However, while modern medicine and science has shaped our world in invaluable ways, we still have so much to learn and understand from the original peoples of this planet. Unfortunately, the vision for medical education and science described in the Flexner Report and fleshed out with the funding of the Rockefellers resulted in doctors being taught to focus on disease and not on a system of preventative health care, a system which could utilize indigenous, and Western medicine. The origins of Big Pharma, the lies of the AMA. Now that the medical industry had been cornered by the Rockefellers and a monopoly on licensing had been established, they began to use their resources to promote the need for pharmaceutical drugs to solve the world's health issues. To do this, the Rockefellers used their resources gained from their oil monopoly to form an alliance with German chemical company IG Farben. In the years leading to World War II, the Rockefeller-controlled Standard Oil of New Jersey, which later became Exxon, purchased a controlling interest in IG Farben. The two companies struck up agreements that would benefit both of their bank accounts. A 1942 article written by journalist Michael Straight for the New Republic states that, quote, with the Standard Oil Company, the marriage, as IG Farben called it, took place in 1929. The dowry which IG bestowed upon its bride was the control in clear world markets of IG's patents covering oil and synthetic gasoline. In return, the bridegroom received full powers over the production, even within the United States, of the chemical children of the Union, including synthetic rubber. The article describes how the Rockefellers' Standard Oil was perfectly aware that IG Farben was reported to have been in the control of the Gestapo as far back as 1934. The Rockefellers' IG Farben plants were instrumental in supporting the Nazis during World War II by supplying the tools needed to develop weapons of war, including the Zyklon B gas used in concentration camps. There are also researchers who believe the Rockefellers not only embraced the financial benefits of a relationship with Hitler's regime, but that they also supported the eugenic philosophy. We will explore that claim in upcoming chapters of this series. The Rockefellers' Farben factories also helped Rockefeller take the petrochemicals from the spoils of the oil industry and use them to begin the mass manufacturing of pharmaceutical drugs. The same drugs that would be increasingly promoted and prescribed by the doctors graduating from medical schools, also funded by Rockefeller. Through their organizations, the Rockefeller Foundation, the General Education Board, the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research, and funding of institutions like Johns Hopkins University and the American Medical Association, the Rockefellers were able to completely influence and control the direction of medical schools and the industry of the 20th and 21st century. In the 1994 book, The Assault on Medical Freedom, author and private investigator P. Joseph Lisa claimed to have gained access to secret files in the American Medical Association's Chicago Department of Investigation. Mr. Lisa says he was hired by a private client to investigate the AMA under the guise of collecting information to expose mental health quackery. In the process, he uncovered hundreds of AMA photocopies of memos, minutes, and other documents. Lisa said he was able to make copies of the original documents and did so without breaking the law. Over the next decade, Lisa says he investigated the documents and found little evidence of quackery and much evidence of an organized propaganda campaign to discredit alternative medicine and foreign drugs. According to Lisa, quackery was, quote, a label that orthodox medicine attached to anything they wanted to discredit in the public's eye. Quacks are practitioners of, quote, a brand of medicine that does not espouse the use of surgery, drugs, or radiation therapy, and who do not come under the control of organized medicine or organized science. Lisa did not believe that quacks didn't exist, but that the medical establishment was using the worst bunch as an excuse to stigmatize alternative medicine and eliminate competitors to the pharmaceutical industry. Lisa wrote in his book that what is happening in the United States is, quote, nothing less than an enforced totalitarian medical pharmaceutical police state, a type of medical McCarthyism. The history of the Rockefeller-funded medical organizations, particularly the American Medical Association, does indicate a support of treatments which are often of questionable value and deplatforming of critics who oppose the medical narratives being spun by Big Pharma and the medical cartel. The AMA has a widely known history of endorsing the use of cigarettes and nicotine as safe and beneficial. The AMA doctors at one point had their own tobacco lounge during their conventions where big tobacco executives could provide them an endless supply of cigarettes. The AMA was one of the last medical organizations to acknowledge the harmful effects of nicotine. Additionally, the AMA and other medical organizations practicing modern, so-called evidence-based medicine have also been proponents of water fluoridation, a practice which was normalized in the United States in the 1940s, but one which immediately faced opposition. Although the practice was supported by the American Medical Association, the American Dental Association, and the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, there are many studies indicating health problems associated with the practice, including lower IQ in children, thyroid disease, bone fractures, and gastrointestinal effects. In fact, in 2020, a lawsuit brought by the Fluoride Action Network against the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency presented evidence of fluoride's harm in a federal court for the first time since water fluoridation began. If the plaintiffs win the lawsuit, it could spell the end of water fluoridation after more than 70 years. The point is, these institutions have a history of misleading the public. We should not ignore these lessons. The modern medical cartel. When we take a deeper look at the history of modern medicine and the corrupting influence of big pharma, we clearly see the same trends we see with the education system, the media, and big wireless. The agencies created to regulate or protect the people from these different industries have been captured by the organizations and corporations they claim to regulate. When it comes to the medical field, we can clearly see that the Rockefeller organizations and the Carnegie Foundation played a direct role in pushing medicine away from traditional indigenous medicines towards a system focused on treating symptoms of disease rather than the root causes. There's also a heavy emphasis on promoting drugs and vaccines. The massive increase in the use of pharmaceutical drugs and vaccines have enriched the world's big pharma conglomerates while also increasing the public's dependency on these substances. Not only has this disrupted the mental health of millions of people around the world, but it has sparked addictions to the pharma drugs themselves. Dr. Peter Breggin is a psychiatrist who has been vocally opposing what he sees as the over-medication of children and society in general. Breggin is the author of many books critical of psychiatric medication, including Toxic Psychiatry, where he is critical of the adverse effects of drugs and medicating children. He has also testified before Congress and federal agencies, including the FDA, and has been an expert on psychiatric drug adverse effects.
We've been hearing testimony all morning from Dr. Peter Breggin, an expert witness and psychiatrist hired by the defense to talk about the effects of antidepressants on the brain. He has so far this morning given a detailed lesson about the human brain and how antidepressants, known as SSRIs, affect the brain. He talked about the drug Celexa, which is not recommended to be prescribed to children. And we know from prior court proceedings that both Conrad Roy and Michelle Carter were on Celexa as teens. Roy was 18 when he took his own life back in 2014. Now, the prosecution says Carter is responsible for his death and therefore guilty of manslaughter, but the defense has said Roy was already suicidal and would have done so no matter what. So this is part of their argument. And here's what Dr. Breggin said about the black box warning on that drug Celexa.
Black box warning specifically says that there's an increased risk of suicide in people age 24 and younger. It describes the studies from which this was determined, and it has a section in it in which it talks about the importance of monitoring people for these adverse effects.
Dr. Breggin is also one of many doctors and health professionals who have been critical of the fight against COVID-19. These critics believe the focus on vaccines and the censoring of alternative treatments for respiratory illnesses is causing more harm than good. These critics are right to question the response to COVID, but as we have shown with the origins of the modern medical industry, we also have many of the same conflicts of interest in relation to the international response to COVID-19. The Rockefeller Foundation is still funding and guiding much of public health policy, but now they are joined by Bill Gates and the Gates Foundation. Gates has spent the last 2 decades mimicking the practices of the Rockefellers and ingratiating himself into nearly every aspect of global health. He is the #1 non-state funder of the World Health Organization, a huge contributor to Johns Hopkins, the Wellcome Trust, and many other powerful health and medical organizations. Gates has continued the focus on treating symptoms of diseases and promoting vaccines. Together, the Gates and Rockefeller families and their partners in pharmaceutical firms are using the COVID-19 crisis as an opportunity to cement themselves as the de facto leaders and policymakers despite not being employed by the governments who follow their dictates. If these unelected billionaires continue to guide global health policy, they will not only gain more unimaginable wealth, but they will push the world further toward policies which do not empower the people, but rather enrich their corporate friends. As of 2021, more and more people around the world are questioning the true intentions of folks like Gates, with countries around the world protesting against lockdowns, mask and vaccine mandates, which they believe violate their right to self-medicate, as well as the principle of bodily autonomy. Unfortunately, this is the world that was born out of the takeover of the health industry and the co-opting of the medical schools and organizations. Solutions. We now have a better understanding of how we arrived at this present moment, a place where vitamins are seen as useless and addictive and destructive drugs are seen as normal. This is the world dreamed up by the Rockefellers, but it doesn't have to be a nightmare that we silently accept and condone. Rather, we have the opportunity to push back, assert our right to medicate ourselves in ways we see fit, and deprive the multinational corporations of profits made from our bodies and minds. How exactly do we do this? The first step is to question authority. We ought not to blindly follow the edicts of the CDC, the FDA, the NHS, or any other governmental health agency or individual. We should always question and probe the answers handed down to us from men and women in lab coats with degrees and letters next to their name. Does this mean that we should never trust the so-called medical and health authorities? That's a decision best left to each individual, but at the least, we need a society that doesn't hang on every word of government officials or corporate representatives without first doing their own research. The fact is that we cannot simply trust the words of the government or their corporate friends who stand to benefit from our ignorance. This means we can check the official government sources, compare that data to the information from critics of the government, reference studies and the sources of the funding of those studies, and finally, come to our own conclusions. Sometimes these conclusions might align with what the official health bodies are saying. Other times, your conclusions might directly conflict with these institutions. At the end of the day, you are the one best suited to make up your own mind about how to handle your health and what to put in your body. If your research finds values in vitamins, a whole foods balanced diet, and daily exercise, then pursue it with passion. Ultimately, you are the one in control of your health. The more informed you are, the more empowered you are. The key to mental and physical health is breaking free from the chains of big pharma and the medical cartel, taking your health back into your hands and unplugging from dependency on these systems. To dive deeper into this field of research, we recommend the following books: Toxic Psychiatry by Dr. Peter Breggin, The Betrayal of Health by Joseph Beasley, Confessions of a Medical Heretic by Dr. Robert S. Mendelsohn, Racketeering in Medicine by Dr. James Puckett, and Medical Nemesis by Ivan Illich. Chapter 8: Food as a Weapon. As we continue our journey through the pyramid, we have learned about the captured agencies within the FCC taking their orders from big wireless. We have also explored the role of the big oil titans in shaping not only the oil industry, but finance, geopolitics, and even medicine. We have seen the names of the Rockefellers and the Rothschilds peppered throughout the histories of these institutions. For this chapter, we are going to examine the claims made about these same characters' involvement in the farming and food industry. There are researchers who believe these cartels are also attempting to manipulate and maybe even control the world's food supply. We're going to find out if there are truths to the concerns around genetically engineered foods and whether or not governments of the world have and might again use food as a weapon. The current paradigm of food and farming. The current paradigm of food production in much of the modern world typically involves growing food at a mass scale, what is often known as industrial or factory farming, while focusing on maximizing production and profits and minimizing costs. This intensive agriculture often involves the heavy use of toxic pesticides on genetically engineered crops. Of the more than 9 billion animals raised for food in the US each year, the vast majority are raised on factory farms, the largest of which are also called Concentrated Animal Feeding Operations, or CAFOs. CAFOs are large-scale factory farms where animals are kept in confined enclosures, unable to freely move or graze on land. Chickens, pigs, and cows are raised in CAFOs. In recent years, critics have become increasingly vocal about the shortcomings of this type of farming. Not only are these farms demeaning and dangerous for the animals, but they greatly contribute to pollution in the local communities surrounding the farms. The biggest source of this pollution comes from the estimated more than 440 million tons of poop generated by confined animals in the US every year. Legally, CAFOs are not required to treat this waste at all. Despite clear evidence of harm to the environment and human health, CAFOs continue to use manure lagoon and spray field systems. In 1972, the US Congress passed the Modern Clean Water Act and directed the EPA to regulate CAFOs. However, current EPA standards allow lagoons to keep polluting due to loopholes that allow CAFOs to continue to exist. Additionally, in the US, nearly every aspect of the industrial food animal production system is highly concentrated and controlled by just a few mega producers. According to a 2019 report from Open Markets titled Food and Power, Addressing Monopolization in America's Food System, nearly all of the seeds, pesticides, and herbicides purchased by farmers come from a handful of big agriculture corporations. Quote, for the past 2 decades, increased consolidation has coincided with the prices of farm inputs increasing faster than the prices farmers receive for their crops. Seeds are often designed to terminate or to fail to germinate after one harvest, forcing farmers to purchase new seeds each season. Consolidated corporations also gain control over producers through seed and chemical product pairings that push farmers into a pesticide treadmill in which they are dependent on both a corporation's evolving seeds and chemical inputs to produce a healthy crop. This combined seed and chemical regime also increases farmers' cost of production, with USDA data showing that per acre cost of soybean and corn seed spiked dramatically between 1995 and 2014 by 351% and 321% respectively. The current mainstream food paradigm, with its toxic, violent, and monopolized business, was born out of the Green Revolution of the 1950s and 60s. Mexican President Manuel Avila Camacho invited the Rockefeller Foundation into the country to help study and modernize Mexico's farming. In 1943, Norman Borlaug, a plant geneticist, and his team of researchers traveled to Mexico and jump-started the so-called Green Revolution. Borlaug was funded by the Rockefeller Foundation and the Ford Foundation, with both organizations having an interest in establishing international farming standards which benefited their bank accounts. While the Green Revolution is often touted as a success due to increases in crop yields and an apparent drop in infant mortality, there is also a growing body of evidence indicating that the abundant use of pesticides has caused a rise in adverse health effects, including cancer. Most infamously, the world's most widely used herbicide, glyphosate, a product of agri-giant Monsanto, now owned by Bayer, has been linked to a number of cases of cancer and resulted in multiple billion-dollar settlements against the company. Bayer is hoping to stem the tide of lawsuits by taking the matter to the U.S. Supreme Court. It's important to note that the same megacorporations involved in the oligarchy and big pharma are also the same driving forces behind the Green Revolution. The Rockefeller Standard Oil Network and their partners within the fertilizer industry, specifically DuPont, Dow Chemical, and Hercules Powder, benefited handsomely from the apparent revolution in farming. However, when a struggling third world nation could not afford the new technologies needed to participate in the programs, the Rockefeller-controlled Chase Manhattan Bank partnered with the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund to offer loans, which in turn granted the banks ownership over resources and financial assets should the nations fail to settle their debts. Another outcome of the Green Revolution is the so-called Gene Revolution, which popularized the use of genetically modified organisms, GMOs, or genetically engineered foods. Once again, the cast of characters involved in the Gene Revolution are identical to the Green Revolution, the Big Pharma cartel, and the oligarchy. The Rockefeller and Nazi-connected IG Farben has subsidiaries Bayer Crop Science and BASF Plant Science working with Dow AgroScience, DuPont Biotechnology, and the infamous Monsanto. All of these corporations benefit from the funding of the Rockefeller Foundation, the Ford Foundation, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and similar organizations. GMOs, safe or dangerous? Before we go any further, let's explain what a GMO is. A GMO is any organism whose genetic makeup has been altered using genetic engineering, and specifically, an organism that was altered in a way that does not occur naturally through mating or natural recombination. While the topic is much bigger than we have time for in this broadcast, the story is much the same as the Green Revolution. Supporters say it increased yields and lifted farmers out of poverty, while critics say the Green Revolution generally, and GMOs specifically, led to a rise in the use of pesticides and a range of potential health problems. So how true are these claims? The mainstream consensus is pretty much that GMOs are absolutely safe, and anyone who suggests otherwise is an anti-science buffoon. There are a number of science sites dedicated to debunking claims made about the harms of genetically engineered foods, and one is not likely to be seen as a credible, intelligent person for questioning the safety of this technology. Let's take a look at the claims made by the anti-GMO movement. The concerns include contamination of the non-genetically modified food supply, the influence of biotech and big ag companies on government regulators, control of the food supply by the same companies, concerns over the use of herbicides with glyphosate, and accusations of playing God by engineering the genes of various life forms. Some critics also fear the implication of patents and intellectual property rights applied to plants and seeds. The resistance to GMO food and Monsanto culminated in the International March Against Monsanto actions taking place in hundreds of cities around the world on May 25, 2013. People all over the world called for the labeling of foods containing GMOs.
Madam President, this is a very conservative amendment. It says that the American people should have the right to know what is in the food that they and their children are eating, and if that food contains genetically engineered products. This amendment grants states the authority to label genetically engineered food. It is not a mandate. It grants states that right, something which, by the way, is now taking place in 49 countries throughout the world. If the people in England, Germany, France, and dozens of other countries have labels allowing their people to know if they are eating food with genetically engineered products,
the senator's time has expired.
States in the United States should have that right. I ask for a yes vote.
The opposition grew steadily during the presidency of Barack Obama as the public grew weary of the revolving door relationship between Monsanto and the White House. The practice began before the Obama administration, with the Bush and Clinton administrations both having favorable relationships with executives from Monsanto, Syngenta, Dow, DuPont, and other biotechnology pesticide companies. While much of the opposition to GMOs does center around captured government agencies and conflicts of interest, the majority of concerns appear to stem from fears of harm to human health resulting from eating food derived from genetic engineering. One of the major studies to show potential harms is the 2012 Seralini study, named for the lead researcher. The study, originally published in the journal Food and Chemical Toxicology, made headlines when it reported that rats studied for 2 years while being exposed to Monsanto's Roundup-tolerant genetically modified maize died 2 to 3 times more than rats not eating GMO corn. The study also claimed female rats developed tumors more often than the rats fed non-GMO corn. The images of the massive tumors on the rats went viral and spread all over the internet. The controversy was quickly followed by complaints from various pro-GMO companies and food regulators. The detractors claimed the scientists were engaged in fraud, or that the Sprague Dawley rat used in the experiment has a high incidence of tumors, and thus GMOs could not be blamed for the results. Before long, Food and Chemical Toxicology retracted the Seralini study, and the public was told that GMOs were totally safe. And that was the end of the Seralini saga. Well, actually, despite the corporate media reporting on the study's retraction, the truth is a bit more complex. While the editors of Food and Chemical Toxicology did say they believed the type of rat used would affect the experiment, they did not dismiss the results of the study altogether. In fact, the retraction states, quote, "Ultimately, the results presented, while not incorrect, are inconclusive, and therefore do not reach the threshold of publication for Food and Chemical Toxicology." Even the claim that inconclusive results are not ready for publication in the journal seems to be a lie based on other published studies which also reach inconclusive results, including other studies involving the same Monsanto GMO corn. Researcher William Engdahl also pointed out obvious conflicts of interest which arose in the months following the publication of the Seralini study. Engdahl wrote, quote, "Then out of the blue, in May 2013, 6 months after the Seralini study release, Elsevier announced that it had created a new position, Associate Editor for Biotechnology. The person they hired to fill it was Richard E. Goodman, a former Monsanto employee who in addition was with the Monsanto pro-GMO lobby organization, the International Life Sciences Institute, which develops industry-friendly risk assessment methods for GM foods and chemical food contaminants and inserts them into government regulations. Then, on November 24, 2013, 6 months after Goodman took control of GMO issues at the journal, Dr. A. Wallace Hayes, the editor of the Journal of Food and Chemical Toxicology, reportedly decided to retract the study by the team of Professor Seralini. After his study was retracted and his name tarnished, Professor Seralini won a defamation lawsuit against a magazine that called the research conducted by him and his team a scientific fraud. Further, in 2014, his team went on to have their study republished in the journal Environmental Sciences Europe. The researchers once again used the Sprague Dawley strain of rat, a fact they acknowledge while also noting that the rat is, quote, recommended for chronic toxicology tests by the National Toxicology Program in the USA, and also used by Monsanto themselves in their own 90-day study. In their final conclusion in the published study, they write, quote, Taken together, the significant biochemical disturbances and the physiological failures documented in this work show that the conclusion of the Monsanto authors that the initial indications of organ toxicity found in their 90-day experiment were not biologically meaningful is not justifiable. We propose that agricultural edible GMOs and complete pesticide formulations must be evaluated thoroughly and long-term studies to measure their potential toxic effects. A corruption of science. Once again, we have an example of the corporate media misrepresenting a story, in this case, a scientific study, and the corporations who stand to lose from the story lobbying the scientific community to make changes. As we have previously demonstrated in this series, the establishment media is a tool for the elite and intelligence agencies. Also, as with the corruption of science from big wireless and the medical cartel, scientific studies can be altered, research can be defunded, and scientists outright threatened until a favorable result is achieved. The simple fact is that the agencies we are told are meant to regulate or protect our food supply and environment, the USDA, the FDA, and the EPA in the United States, and similar agencies around the world, are largely captured in the same fashion as the FCC, the CDC, and other federal agencies. For one reason or another, these agencies seem determined to ignore, silence, or discredit research pointing to potential dangers of GMOs or pesticides. For example, Jonathan Lundgren, an entomologist working for the U.S. Department of Agriculture, filed a whistleblower complaint against his employer for suppressing his research, which found that certain pesticides may be affecting bee and butterfly populations. The USDA sought to dismiss Lundgren's complaint as frivolous and based on speculative and unsupported allegations. However, the courts ruled in favor of Lundgren. Lundgren originally filed an internal complaint in September 2014, accusing the USDA of retaliating against him because of his research. The complaint was dismissed by the USDA, and Lundgren was suspended in October 2014. He was suspended for 3 days after USDA investigators found emails among his research staff which included indecent jokes. On October 28, 2015, Lundgren filed a complaint with the Federal Merit Systems Protection Board after his supervisors allegedly began to, quote, impede or deter his research and resultant publications. Lundgren's complaint alleged that his supervisors suspended him in retaliation for his research on neonicotinoid pesticides and his calls for an investigation of both the USDA and the Environmental Protection Agency. The experience of Jonathan Lundgren does not seem to be an isolated one. According to the Public Employees for Environmental Responsibility, the organization representing Lundgren, at least 10 USDA scientists have been investigated or faced other consequences arising from research that called into question the safety of certain agricultural chemicals. In 2015, PEER filed a legal petition with the U.S. Department of Agriculture seeking new rules that would enhance job protection for government scientists whose research questions the safety of farm chemicals. In late December 2016, researchers with France's National Institute for Agricultural Research confirmed the allegations of conflicts of interest involved in GMO research. The study found that nearly half of studies on genetically modified crops were found to have conflicts of interest. The study also concluded that GM studies with conflicts of interest had an increased likelihood of drawing conclusions which favored genetically modified or engineered foods. The researchers examined 579 published studies and found that around 40% showed at least one conflict of interest. In these cases, the conflict was typically related to someone involved with the study also working as an employee of a GM company or having received funds directly from the company. The director of research at France's National Institute for Agricultural Research told the media, quote, "We thought we would find conflicts of interest, but we did not think we would find so many." It is these conflicts of interest which have caused much of the public to view official proclamations about the safety of genetically engineered foods with skepticism. Although the FDA has downplayed any efforts to label GM foods as potentially hazardous, previously unreleased FDA documents show the agency was aware of possible risk to humans as far back as 1991. The documents were released through a lawsuit filed by Stephen Drucker, a public interest attorney and executive director for the Alliance of Biointegrity. Drucker obtained 44,000 pages of messages, memos, and reports from the FDA and released them in his book, Altered Genes, Twisted Truth. One such document, the FDA's 1992 Statement of Policy, Foods Derived from New Plant Varieties, stated that the agency was, quote, not aware of any information showing that GMOs differ in any meaningful way from other food, despite memos showing researchers did, indeed, have questions about the safety of GE foods. One FDA compliance officer wrote that the agency, quote, was trying to fit a square peg into a round hole by trying to force an ultimate conclusion that there is no difference between foods modified by genetic engineering and foods modified by traditional breeding practices. The processes of genetic engineering and traditional breeding are different, and according to technical experts in the agency, they lead to different risks. It's abundantly clear that there is more to the story when it comes to the safety of genetically engineered foods and pesticides. When we look beyond the corporate media headlines, we can see that the science is not settled. Food as a weapon of war. One final area of research, which is extremely pertinent to the conversation around what might be termed big food, is the history of food being used as a weapon during times of war. Throughout modern and ancient history, we have examples of warring nations using food as a way to destroy their enemy or empower their allies. Providing or withholding food during conflict is equally as powerful as guns, drones, and missiles. Controlling an opponent's access to food is important during war and can also be a bargaining tactic. Sometimes food is used as a weapon by destroying the harvest or preventing a harvest from being shipped to other locations. The phrase, salting the earth, was born out of the ritual of spreading salt in the soil of a conquered land in an effort to prevent crops from growing again. The U.S. has historically used food as a tool of foreign policy, delivering aid to nations which follow programs favored by the U.S. and its allies, and initiating embargoes and tariffs on food goods for nations which do not comply. In recent years, there have also been discussions on using food to blackmail nations into adopting population control programs.
The United States, through the Agency for International Development, has provided rapidly increasing support for population and family planning programs throughout the developing world.
This might sound like insanity, but a 1974 memo drafted by former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger outlines the entire plan. The memo is called National Security Study Memorandum 200, Implications of Worldwide Population Growth for U.S. Security and Overseas Interests, and was drafted by Kissinger for the United States National Security Council. The memo focuses on the paramount importance to population control measures and the promotion of contraceptive measures to 13 populous nations known as the least developing countries. The argument was that the socio-political and economic growth of these countries is vital to national interest of the U.S. since the U.S. economy will require large and increasing amounts of minerals from abroad, and the countries can produce destabilizing opposition forces against the U.S. The Kissinger report discusses how there already existed a precedent for, quote, taking account of family planning performance and appraisal of assistance requirements by U.S. aid. The report goes on to state that allocation of scarce resources should, quote, take account of what steps a country is taking in population control as well as food production. The document also notes that it is important to, quote, avoid the appearance of coercion while also discussing mandatory programs. The document also considers whether or not food can be considered, quote, an instrument of national power. The document states, is the U.S. prepared to accept food rationing to help people who can't or won't control their population growth? Of course, it should be noted that Henry Kissinger, former Secretary of State, is a longtime associate of the Rockefeller agenda. Our conversation started with the Rockefeller-driven Green Revolution and the Gene Revolution, and now we come full circle with the Rockefellers' latest initiative, Reset the Table. The Rockefeller Foundation is now claiming that COVID-19 and the economic losses from lockdowns have, quote, made the negative consequences of the food system worse and more obvious. The foundation notes that COVID-19 has presented the moment to transform the U.S. food system. The Rockefeller document, titled Reset the Table, Meeting the Moment to Transform the U.S. Food System, outlines how the Rockefeller Foundation can once again use its money and influence to shape the direction of a major industry, this time the food supply itself. Ironically, the Reset the Table document also notes that the Rockefeller Foundation played a role in seeding and scaling the Green Revolution, while also noting that the Rockefeller Green Revolution left a legacy of, quote, overemphasis of staple grains at the expense of more nutrient-rich foods, and a, quote, reliance on chemical fertilizers that deplete the soil and overuse of water. With no hint of shame, the Rockefellers and their ilk will present themselves as the solution to problems they have previously contributed to or outright created. Using the same flowery language and trendy buzzwords which allowed them to infiltrate and capture the education system, the oil industry, and the medical field, they have managed to gain control over the large institutions which farm the world's animals and crops in violent, destructive, and costly ways. This dangerous monopolistic cartel has captured many national and international regulatory bodies designed to protect the public and the food supply. The players involved in this piece of the pyramid of power also continue to use their wealth and connections to suppress research which paints their products and investments in a negative light, including GMOs and pesticides. Finally, these criminal elements have made it clear that they believe food can be, and indeed should be, used as a tool for negotiation or a tool for forcing compliance from populations. Solutions: local and decentralized food systems. Learning to identify the people and institutions which make up the pyramid is only one vital component of this journey. The second, equally important step is to identify and implement solutions which can help the masses to break free from these immoral people and their corruption. One solution which applies to all aspects of the pyramid is to continue to question authority and official sources. As with previous investigations, we see that blindly trusting the government science or industry-funded research is a mistake. It's very easy to ignore the warnings from scientists and health professionals who warn about health concerns and environmental damage caused by factory farming, pesticides, and genetically engineered foods, especially when corporate media and mainstream science organizations are telling you what to think. This is not to say that the corporate media or mainstream governmental science should never be trusted any more than it should always be trusted. The focus should be employing critical thinking, using discernment, and taking a nuanced view as opposed to a simple black and white view. Another empowering solution to break free of the industrial farming system and the inefficient food distribution system is to begin growing your own food. Whether you begin with a backyard or front yard garden, or join a community garden or community-supported agriculture, the key is to localize your food supply. By supporting or building local and decentralized farming networks, you are taking power away from big ag and big food. At the same time, you are building local food security by ensuring your communities are not dependent on supermarket grocery chains for all of your food. Local farming built on permaculture principles is also better for the environment and wildlife. While some people might choose to find a freedom cell with like-minded people, leave the cities and towns, buy land, and build their permaculture paradise, others will stay in the cities and build urban farming and food distribution networks. The key is to sever any dependencies you have on the mainstream food production and distribution systems. If our international communities continue to allow the convenience of supermarkets with infinite options to distract us from the increasingly necessary work of building food security, we are going to remain beholden to the titans of industry who aim to manipulate the world via technology, energy, medicine, and food. We must continue to question the agendas in front of us and remember that what we put in our bodies, what we choose to use as nourishment for our vessel, will determine the direction of our mental, physical, and spiritual health. We cannot entrust our health to those who believe in using food as a weapon. We must remember to use our food as our medicine. We must support localized, decentralized neighborhood farms so that organic, nutrient-rich crops can be grown and provided to communities which have historically faced food deserts. This is the key to escaping the destructive, genetically modified, and pesticide-laden food system. This is the key to escaping from the pyramid of power. For a deeper understanding on GMOs, pesticides, and the takeover of the food supply, check out the following reports: The World According to Monsanto, The Technocratic Transhumanist Total Takeover of Food by Ice Age Farmer, Genetic Fallacy, How Monsanto Silences Scientific Dissent by James Corbett. To learn more about permaculture, visit discoverpermaculture.org. To learn about indigenous permaculture, visit the International Institute of Indigenous Science.